Hey 302, I'm Jackie Ferris. On this week's show, we visit the Delaware Historical Society and take a walk through some Delawareana. Get ready to put fascination on blast. The 302 is headed your way. Hey 302, I'm Jackie Ferris. We are at the Delaware Historical Society. We're talking about a very special exhibit. It's Paul Preston Davis collecting Wilmington Place Perspective and Memory. I'm joined now by Lee Reifenberg, Chief Curator of the exhibit. Lee, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So this is a very large and unusual exhibit. Would you not agree?
I do, absolutely. It's a large and unusual collection, so it really warranted something like this.
So how did you come to have the collection?
This comes to us from a longtime friend and benefactor of the Society named Paul Preston Davis, and he's been donating things sort of piecemeal fashion for many, many years. But we knew that he had this collection that he'd been amassing for over 40 years and was about ready to find it a permanent home. And we knew that he was intending to do that here at the Delaware Historical Society. So fall of 2018, he called me and indicated that he was ready for the collection to come. He and his wife were going to be downsizing and moving. So we had to figure out a plan fairly quickly to get a 230-box collection from his home here to the museum and to do that safely and in an organized way. So it was a little bit of a challenge at the beginning, but we made it work, and now it's here in a safe home.
I can imagine, you know, in looking at some of the items, not all of them are in the exhibit, but you had to pick and choose between the items, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But how did he start with, you said 240 boxes, what did he start with?
That's actually an interesting story. This whole collecting craze for him started with what was a very unusual gift. When he was 9 years old, Mr. Davis's aunt gave him a family treasure, which was an 18th century ledger from Philadelphia. It had been in the family for many, many years, which seems an unusual gift to give a 9-year-old boy, but he recognized its significance from the very beginning. And even at an age when he was collecting baseball cards and things like that with most of his friends, this ledger really resonated with him, and it sort of started a collecting bug. And then in later years, as a young man, he was serving in the Coast Guard in the Korean War, and he would use his days off in port to go to flea markets and book sales and old bookshops and things like that. And that sort of further cemented his collecting craze. So he really began with books, and specifically children's books, but that became something of a rabbit hole for him. He realized that there was just too much material. He wasn't able to really focus, and so he decided that he was going to set the books aside, at least temporarily, and look at something that he could really get his teeth into and focus on and research. And that became the business history of Wilmington. And so he began to collect this sort of massive collection that falls into, we would say, 5 main categories. Paper ephemera, which is material that was really not intended to last very long, but it's mostly advertising material, trade cards, billheads, things like that would advertise local businesses and services in Wilmington. He collected rare print materials and books eventually, not the children's books, but other things related to Wilmington printers. He collected photography, which is one of my favorite sections of the collection, this massive, beautiful collection of early photography representing all of the major Wilmington studios. He collected sheet music, and eventually he collected objects as well. This is a predominantly paper-based and archival collection, but he also eventually collected Wilmington-made watches and other objects from the city.
So his focus for all of these categories was preserving and collecting things that, you know, showed what it was like there's a bill, right, in the collection?
There are many bills in the collection,
okay.
Yes. So this really is a collection that represents the latter half of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, it's mostly business history. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty remarkable and incredibly diverse. So one of the biggest challenges that we've had in curating this exhibit was choosing what to put out and what we had to leave back in the archive, because we're really just scratching the surface here. There's so much more to this collection than we're able to show in 19 cases.
So what does it, when you look at the case and you see some of the exhibits, what does it tell you about? I know we talk about the business, a lot of it's business things, but there's also the black cat exhibit at the end. I mean, what does it tell us about Wilmington and about Delaware?
It tells us that Wilmington was an incredibly diverse and vibrant place that was developing and kind of coming out of its shell in the 19th century. When we think about larger cities, we certainly think of Wilmington as an extension of Philadelphia and even Baltimore in some cases, but Wilmington stood on its own. And really during this period of immense change in the aftermath of the Civil War, we're seeing industrialization, we're seeing Wilmington really start to develop as a city on its own, and this collection really reflects that.
And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of the things in the collection with Lee when we return.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Duffy, and I'm so excited to be back on the 302 with all the best exhibitions in the Delaware area.
Welcome back. We're talking about the Paul Preston Davis collection of Delawareana. Is that how you say that?
That's it, yes.
So there's so much. You were talking about the business and from personal to business, but the trade cards. Talk to us about those.
So trade cards are actually the precursor to modern day business cards. They would have had all of the sort of standard information about a business, but they also contained a lot of sort of interesting imagery. And in many cases, what's interesting about 19th century trade cards is that the image on the front often had little or nothing to do with the business or service that it was advertising. And so that's one of the most interesting things about the trade cards in this collection. There are 12,000 of them in total. The interesting thing about the way that trade cards are collected and marketed is that they're often not organized geographically. So Mr. Davis went to great pains over 40 years to actually find specifically Wilmington trade cards, and it was not an easy task. He went through a number of people's garages. He went through album after album that other collectors had saved. In some cases they had to be carefully removed because they were glued into scrapbooks. He collected the scrapbooks themselves in some cases, but it was a real sort of journey for him to go from this paper collecting in the 1970s and 80s in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and then eventually to collect trade cards on eBay, which changed the game for a lot of paper collectors.
It must have been a daunting task to have that many trade cards to pick which ones would represent the overall category.
It was one of the hardest tasks, and the trade cards are actually the first phase, the first of 5 phases of the exhibit. So it was something that we spent an entire summer doing, and we went through folder after folder after folder, so thousands and thousands that we looked at, and they were all so amazing. It was an incredibly difficult decision. Eventually we were looking for certain types of images that really represented the values of the 19th century. Some of them are kind of alarming, some of them are uncomfortable to look at. There are some stereotypical and very racist images in the collection, but we didn't want to hide that. We felt that it was important to tell those stories as well, that this was a part of advertising, sort of uglier side of advertising that was just kind of inculcated in the system, and people often thought it was funny.
Gives you a snapshot of what people were thinking and everything at the time.
It does. It really does help. Part of the reason that we opened with the trade cards and other ephemera is that it really helps to situate you in the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's part of sort of our key themes of place, perspective, and memory, and this really does give you a sense of place when we first begin to look at the collection.
So you mentioned the 5 phases or 5 areas. One of them, really nice, watches.
Yes. That's actually our latest part of the exhibit, phase 4. We just opened it, in fact, on a Friday, so it's brand new. We're excited for people to come up and see that. Interestingly, Mr. Davis, because the bulk of this collection is paper-based and archival, Mr. Davis did not intend to get into collecting watches or any objects for that matter. What he was interested in were watch papers, which a lot of people don't know about. And watch papers were tiny little round slips of paper that, when you got a watch repaired, would be slipped in between the watch casing and the workings, and that would let you know that the work had been done on your watch. So they're incredibly thin, they're incredibly small. They weren't intended to last very long, and that makes them very, very rare on the collector's market. So that's what Mr. Davis was collecting initially. And then as he got into the age of eBay and was able to sort of look beyond sort of regional collecting and be able to have access to collectors from all over the country, he found a Delaware-made watch with a Delaware watch paper. And as he basically told us, that's like a unicorn on the collector's market. So he realized that perhaps he'd been a little bit too narrow in his focus, and so that it was time to start looking at the watches as well as the watch papers.
I know it's very personal. Someone carried that in their pocket for many, many years, but there are a couple of things that are very personal, like the friendship albums, for instance. You have two, or more than two, but two that really stand out. One being that it was owned by an African-American woman.
Exactly. Friendship albums, for those who don't know, we would think of them in the way that we sign school yearbooks at the end of the year. You would write a crazy message to your friends or something to help them remember you. Friendship albums were a little bit more of a genteel practice. It's something that would have been done mostly by young women of high school age. Although some men did it as well. We do have a male friendship album in the exhibit as well. But the kinds of things that you wrote in your friend's album said a lot about you. So the stakes were fairly high. And typically the entries were sort of very morally upstanding. Sometimes they were biblical quotes. Sometimes they were these very sort of sentimental and flowery passages from poets or things like that. So it really did say a lot about the signer. They would have been judged on their handwriting. It would have been judged on the passage that they chose. All of this would have said a great deal about your social standing, about your education. So there was a lot of pressure in being asked to sign a friend's album, much more so than the sort of off-the-cuff message you might write in a friend's yearbook today. The stakes were even higher for African-American women because the print market had largely ignored them. Ignored their individuality, and so the friendship album was a way of keeping touch with friends who might have been separated. It was a way of commenting very subtly on Black life during the 19th century. So there were sort of messages. They were a little bit more layered, a bit more meaningful in some cases than their white counterparts. But what's really important about the friendship album in this collection is that it represents only the 6th known example in a public collection of a friendship album owned by an African-American woman. So we're very, very proud of it and very, very excited to have it.
Excellent. Now I know that there's also a friendship album from a woman who had a boy sign it twice, and there's like some back history.
That's sort of a fun one. You never know what you're going to find in these friendship albums as you start to page through them, and not all of them were serious and sentimental. One of my favorites there, because there's always that kid in the class who writes something funny, and so there's one young woman who writes to her friend, don't play with the boys, they're very bad toys. So some of them were sort of irreverent and funny. But there was a young woman named Lizzie Schaub, and Lizzie she asked all of her friends, obviously, to sign the album, but she asked one young man in particular to sign it twice, which he did. His name was Barton, and Barton not only signed Lizzie's album twice, but he drew these very intricate sketches and things for her. And we wondered at the time why a young girl would ask a boy to sign her album twice, and so we did a little bit of research, and it turns out that Barton and Lizzie got married. They had a daughter, and what's really sort of moving to me is when you go to the very end of the album, you'll see that Barton and Lizzie's daughter has written a note to her mother after she had died, wishing she and her friends peace. So it's a really sort of lovely memento and something special in the collection.
Well, there are a lot of things that are special in this collection. We're going to look at some of these boxes when we come back.
My name is Elizabeth Lachlan, and I'm the state senator for Delaware's 3rd State Senate District, and you're watching the 302. I love it.
Welcome back. We are at the Delaware Historical Society, where we're looking at the Paul Preston Davis collection of Delawareana, and we're now behind the scenes, places that you wouldn't normally get to go. Lee, this is amazing. 240 boxes with lots of great stuff.
Absolutely, and we try to, this is behind closed doors, but there is glass in the door so that people can look in and actually see the collection in its entirety. One of the things that makes this collection and our donor so special is that Mr. Davis actually donated all of these materials in the boxes, in archival quality, acid-free boxes for their preservation. And this kind of thing is prohibitively expensive, so it was almost a gift, a double gift in that sense, because it would have taken us many, many years to have purchased these materials to house the collection safely. So we were very, very fortunate. He was also very careful to organize his collections according to a system that he devised himself. And very often he would undo days of work if he sort of saw a flaw in that system and would go back and redo it. So we're just reaping the benefits of his organization, and we're very, very lucky. One of the final phases that I'm going to show you is some of our Wilmington photography. This is one of the largest portions of the collection, and one about about which Mr. Davis was very, very passionate. And what we have are images and photography representing the very beginnings of photography all the way up through the early 20th century. So we're very, very lucky. This is actually one of our earliest forms of photography. It's called the daguerreotype, and a daguerreotype often came, would have been very expensive for the average Wilmingtonian to afford. It came in these beautifully ornate cases, so they're also often called cased images. And this one, as you'll see, they're highly reflective and
almost
really
like a
beautiful,
mirror.
Almost like a mirror. And that's the way that you can tell a daguerreotype, actually, because there was silver in the emulsion, and so that's what makes it so highly reflective, and also what made it so expensive for the average person to afford. So this is not something that, you know, your average middle class Wilmingtonian would have been able to afford. So the sitters you'll see are very serious. That was expected at the time. You weren't going to smile for one of these, and this couple obviously reflects that. You would have worn your very best clothes. You would have had to sit still for quite a long time, and it would have been a very serious and important event in your life. So that's we have many of these. This is from the Broadbent Studio in Wilmington, and we have many, many more from various other photographers. We also have later examples of photography. This one is called the tin type, literally because it is printed on a piece of tin. Sometimes they're also called ferriotypes.
This is a soldier?
This is a soldier. This is an African-American Civil War soldier, which makes it all the more rare and important to us. Up to this point, and this just really says, again, everything you need to know about the Davis collection, up to this point in our collections at the Delaware Historical Society, we had very few images, and particularly tin-type images, of African Americans represented. We now have an entire album full in addition to this one, so it really has just enhanced our collections in every way. Later on, photography gets to be democratized and certainly more affordable for people with what's called the carte de visite, or CDV. And these two were actually from the same photographer. Her name was Emily Webb, and she's known as one of Delaware's first female photographers. You might find it interesting that a photographer would be taking a picture of a chicken, but Emily Webb was also very much an animal rights activist. In fact, after her photography career was over, she helped to form the Delaware chapter of the SPCA. So there are multiple sort of stories here. But the carte de visite were certainly smaller. These would have been collectible. You would have gotten several at a time, sort of in the way that we get wallet pictures today to hand out. You would have given them to your family and friends, and people would have collected them in albums in much the same way that we do today. Emily was famous for photographing children and animals, among other things. She also photographed quite a few African American subjects. One of the fun things about her advertising, though, and you'll see this as we turn the photos around, is that she only ever advertised as E. Webb. And the reason for that is she didn't want people to know that she was a woman and potentially lose business. So basically, by the time you were already in her studio, it was too late, and you would have been able to get your portrait taken. But Emily was quite a character in Wilmington history, and we're really lucky to have these images that she took.
So this is an amazing collection. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been to boil it all down to just a snapshot for people to come and check out. How long is the collection available for people to see?
Now that the entire exhibit is open, we're planning to have it open for at least 2 years because we want to give people opportunities to come in and enjoy it. It's been a great teaching tool. We've been able to develop a lot of programming out of it. So the Davis collection is continuing to give to us even after the exhibit is open. So it's really a gift to the people of Delaware and beyond. The good news is you don't have to be from Delaware or even from Wilmington to appreciate it. This really says a lot about what it means to collect, what it means to be a collector, and how we treat our own collections in our own lives, and how that sort of gives us a meaningful sense of place and memory.
So if someone wants to get more information, is there a website, Facebook, Instagram?
All of the above. You're welcome to visit our website at dehistory.org. We also have an active Facebook and Instagram page. You're welcome to come to the museum Wednesday through Sunday. We're open 12 to 5. This exhibit, just everybody should note, is on the second floor. So once you've seen all of the beautiful galleries on the first floor, you'll just take the elevator upstairs and come and see Mr. Davis's exhibit as well.
Lee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
it really
you,
has
Jackie.
been a pleasure. We'll be right back. For more information on this fascinating exhibit, visit dehistory.org. That'll do it for this week's show. We're going to leave you now with a beautiful view by the riverfront. Until next time, I'm Jackie Ferris. We'll see you on the 302.